Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you for this wonderful meeting of minds, because that's what we're doing. That's who we are. This is the third of a series on the spiritual path presented by universaltheosophy.com and the United Lodge of Theosophists. And today we're going to hear two presentations. The first will be by Russ on the search for truth. And then we'll hear from Wes Ammerman on Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So really wonderful topics. And it's really been a great series. We've heard some wonderful talks, some wonderful exchanges of ideas, and good discussion. Last week, we heard from Vikash on the science of self-transformation, from Alex on the Eightfold Noble Path, and the series began with a talk by Jerry on the self-evolving circle of identity, and Ava on confidence and virtue on the path. So this week, we come to the conclusion, and the attendance has been great. The quality has been wonderful. I want to remind folks that there will be an International White Lotus Day celebration on Saturday, May 13th at 10 a.m. at this time. And if you would like more information on that or on any of the discussion groups and other offerings, go to universaltheosophy.com. On the far right-hand side at the top, there's a community tab that'll bring down a menu that has the classes, discussion groups, and events. So without further ado, I would like to then turn it over to Russ. Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead, Russ.
Thank you, Joe. Let me see how this works here.
Russ, I think you're muted somehow.
I'm sorry. So sorry. Now, it goes without saying that a subject like the search for truth, it cannot be nailed down. It can't be fully encompassed, no matter what we say about it, because there will always be more to add, to wonder about, and to question. How could it really be otherwise when you're dealing with such an abstract and difficult and ultimately undefinable concept such as truth? So we'll just start out with a little quote from Henry David Thoreau, which I like very much. This is from his essay, which is titled Walking. It appears in a posthumous collection of his essays that Emerson put together and published called Excursions. And Joe is going to be reading some of the quotes, so I'm going to put this up on the screen now and see if we can get it. There we go. So go ahead, Joe.
This is from Walking, from Excursions. My desire for knowledge is intermittent, but my desire to bathe my head in atmospheres unknown to my feet is perennial and constant. The highest that we can attain to is not knowledge, but sympathy with intelligence. I do not know that this higher knowledge amounts to anything more definite than a novel and grand surprise on a sudden revelation of the insufficiency of all that we called knowledge before, a discovery that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophy. It is the lighting up of the mist by the sun. Man cannot know in any higher sense than this, any more than he can look serenely and with impunity in the face of the sun.
Thank you. Um, I really love that phrase of his. The highest we can attain to is not knowledge, but sympathy with intelligence. I think that's a way of describing our intuition, I think. We are all faced at various times in our life and in many ways with life's great mysteries, those deep philosophical existential questions that pester us, we often ponder over, especially when we're experiencing hardships, disruption, or undergoing some kind of suffering, such as the loss of a loved one, or when we contemplate our own death and ultimate demise, at least of our physical bodies. And when we observe the constant change and the impermanence of our circumstances and our surroundings, such things often prompt us to ask really deep questions about our life, its purpose, its meaning. Or sometimes these sorts of questions come to us during times of reflection and contemplation. We ask such questions like as what is ultimately real, if anything? What is consciousness? Where does it come from? Does life have any meaning? Does my life have any meaning? Is there such a thing as a soul? Is there any continuity of consciousness after death? Are the beliefs and conceptions that I now have regarding any of these things good enough? Is it possible to have any kind of knowledge or assurance as to any of this? And many or most have experienced from time to time a feeling of deep connection, of there being some transcending aspect of ourselves, more real than our personalities, our bodies, and our immediate environment and our circumstances. And feelings such as this, such as the expansiveness we feel when viewing a sunrise or gaze into a dark, starry night, or wake up from an especially numinous dream. Now, these can help to stir within us a sense of reality, however undefined and dimly felt, for the presence within us of the divine or godlike, partaking of universality, connected with all of great nature, a sense, so to speak, of our divine roots. And Emerson, he put that rather beautifully in his statement. This is from his book, Nature, where he says, "Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God." I think it would be fair to say that this is the condition most thinking people find themselves in. You know, we're aware that our knowledge is partial and incomplete, and our understanding is very limited. Our conceptions are so often confused or half-baked. And yet we are goaded by our intuitive recognition of greater possibilities. We yearn for deeper understanding, for an apprehension of connection and meaning. But the very search itself, the determined effort to reach a deeper understanding of what we truly are. It's the very essence of the spiritual path, as are the efforts we undertake towards becoming wiser and more compassionate, more deeply intelligent men and women. Such effort is central to what it really means to be a human being. We are self-conscious mind beings, constantly thinking, and by our very nature, we seek for the meaning of things and to expand the scope of our knowledge and our awareness. Now I keep saying we. Sadly, most folks probably don't care much about such things, or simply leave their thinking to others, or are content with their creeds and their beliefs and their conventions. So I'm talking about those who are beginning to wake up mentally, who think it for themselves and are really ponder the mysteries of life. H.P. Blavatsky gave a very broad statement of what it means to be a theosophist in her article, What Are the Theosophists? And Joe, maybe you could read this.
Be what he may, once a student abandons the old and trodden highway of routine and enters the solitary path of independent thought Godward, he is a theosophist, an original thinker, a seeker after the eternal truth, with, quote, an inspiration of his own to solve the universal problems.
Thank you. Before we get to this, I was going to say that the asking of tough questions and digging into the meaning of things was very much what Socrates thought we ought to do, and so we have this very familiar passage from the Platonic dialogue, the Apology, where Socrates is making his defense before his accusers, and he states the following, and Joe, you could read this.
And if again, I should say that this is the greatest good to man, to discourse every day concerning virtue and other things which you have heard me discussing, exploring both myself and others. And if I should also assert that a life without investigation is not worthy of a man to live, much less, were I thus to speak, would you believe me? These things, however, Athenians, are as I say, but it is not easy to persuade you that they are so.
Thank you. And sadly, in our day and age, philosophy is often seen as a primarily intellectual, academic pursuit, the study of musty old theories and logic chopping, without much relevance to how we live our lives, or earn our living, or make our choices. But that is not so. The word itself, Philosophia, divine wisdom, it's a love for wisdom. I mean, philos is I said divine wisdom, that's the Theosophy, but philosophy, philos is a love, and Sophia means wisdom, a love for wisdom. A love of wisdom it's a reverence for the eternal verities. And the Platonic view of philosophy was briefly described by Madame Blavatsky in this comment in her article, Old Philosophers and Modern Critics, which I'll read. It is the province of the discipline of philosophy to disenthrall the soul from the bondage of sense and to raise it into the empyrean of pure thought, to the vision of eternal truth, goodness, and beauty. thus uniting it to spirit. And we should take a close look at this statement because there's so much in it. Philosophy, in this higher sense, is referred to here as a discipline, which suggests an undertaking of self-control, of deliberate exercise of the will, control of the mind, taking hold of the reins, with the object of disenthralling the soul from the bondage of sense. The soul here being the mind, the arena of thought, of feeling, imagination. So the discipline of philosophy brings about, in this view, a reorientation, a change of direction away from the mind's natural inclination to identify and become attached with the body and its circumstances, with the likes and dislikes and appetites and desires of the body and its personality, which gives rise to selfishness and egotism and a sense of separateness. And it raises us into the empyrean of pure thought. And what does that mean? Well, we might say it awakens to a recognition of the greater reality for abstractions, of principles and archetypes, which makes possible, as she says, a perception or a vision of eternal truth, goodness, and beauty, thus uniting it to spirit, or the universal self. In Thoreau's terms, these are the atmospheres unknown to our feet, the noetic realms of the higher mind. Blavatsky makes a similar statement in her article, What is Truth?, in which she points out that for those living in the material world, where the mind is geared towards dealing with physical existence, which is where we are engaged for most of our waking life, there can be no direct perception of absolute truth, which is beyond the range and reach of ordinary thought. We are, she says, as incapable of reaching to absolute truth as we are of reaching the moon on a bicycle. So we have to deal with relative truths, and we need to do the best we can with them. Sifting out those ideas that seem the most valid, that partake most of reality. But we can, she says, begin to open up to it a bit, absorbing by degrees some of its rays. Speaking of the absolute truth, we can open up to it a bit, she says. And there are two methods for bringing that about. First, on the physical plane, we must use what she terms our mental polariscope. And analyzing the properties of each ray, choose the purest. So this suggests the rigorous use of the mind, the use of both inductive and deductive logic in examining the truthfulness, the validity of our concepts and beliefs and assumptions. Do they hold up? Do they agree with what we observe in the world? Do they lead to absurd or unacceptable consequences? Do they agree with our intuitive sense of what is right and good? And this is the kind of examination of our fundamental ideas that we're encouraged to do all the time. This constant process of examination. And then she says this, and from the same article. And Joe, I guess I'll have you read this.
On the plane of spirituality, to reach the sun of truth, we must work in dead earnest for the development of our higher nature. We know that by paralyzing gradually within ourselves the appetites of the lower personality, and thereby deadening the voice of the purely physiological mind, that mind which depends upon and is inseparable from its medium of vehicle, the organic brain, the animal man in us may make room for the spiritual. And once aroused from its latent state, the highest spiritual senses and perceptions grow in us in proportion and develop pari passu with the divine man. This is what the great adepts, the yogis in the East and the mystics in the West, have always done and are still doing.
Thank you. Well, that is our project. It is without doubt the most difficult task imaginable, but it is one that all of us must undertake step by step, sooner or later, and if not in this lifetime, then in some future one. But anyone can choose to at least get started. In chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna sort of complains to Krishna, and he says this: "O slayer of Madhu, on account of the restlessness of the mind, I do not perceive any possibility of steady continuance in this yoga of equanimity, which thou hast declared. For indeed, O Krishna, the mind is full of agitation. It is turbulent, strong, and obstinate. I believe the restraint of it to be as difficult as that of the wind." And Krishna replies to him, yes, without doubt, the mind is restless and hard to restrain, but it may be restrained, O son of Kunti, by practice and absence of desire. Yet, in my opinion, this divine discipline called yoga is very difficult for one who hath not his soul in his own control. Yet it may be acquired through proper means and by one who is assiduous and controlleth his heart. And he says a little bit later, he says, "Wherefore, O Arjuna, resolve thou to become a man of meditation." Now, much of what is involved in becoming a man or woman of meditation, which is what the search for truth or for self-knowledge entails in all of its many forms of expression. Much has been set forth in these meetings over the past couple of weeks, the importance of getting over our ego-centeredness, of recognizing the essential unity of all of life, understanding our underlying kinship and solidarity with our fellow human beings. There was a discussion of the paramitas, or the virtues found in the voice of the silence, which one must take to heart when treading the spiritual path. And last week we heard a talk on the science of self-transformation. And we heard about the Noble Eightfold Path taught by the Gautama Buddha. These are all greatly important aspects of the spiritual path. And I would like to speak about some other facets which while they were touched upon, I think are also very important to consider. Let's start with what Krishna says to Arjuna in the 4th chapter of the Gita. And Joe, if you would.
Seek this wisdom by doing service, by strong search, by questions, and by humility. The wise who see the truth will communicate it unto thee, and knowing which thou shalt never again fall into error, O son of Bharata. By this knowledge thou shalt see all things and creatures whatsoever in thyself, and then in me. Even if thou wert the greatest of all sinners, thou shalt be able to cross over all sins in the bark of spiritual knowledge. There is no purifier in this world to be compared to spiritual knowledge, and he who is perfected in devotion findeth spiritual knowledge springing up spontaneously in himself in the progress of time.
Thank you. Doing service, strong search, questions, and humility. I'd like to say some things about humility and about doing service. Now, humility most certainly does not mean assuming a self-deprecating position that we are just poor, weak-willed, sinful mortals, contemptible and unworthy of anything, that we are anything but godlike. That's just another form of egotism, really. Humility is rather an attitude in keeping with the need for us to overcome our egotism. It is a recognition that we as personalities are just not all that important. It is a willingness to acknowledge our ignorance and to learn from others, to admit that we could be, and no doubt are, wrong about a great many things. That whatever our concepts are about just about anything, they will likely be distorted or incomplete. It is an attitude exemplified by Socrates, who he was puzzled by the oracle's declaration that he was the wisest man in Athens. And he set out to find out why. Why is this oracle saying that I'm the wisest person in Athens? And he eventually recognized that he was considered the wisest because he professed his ignorance, and he did not pretend to know what he actually did not know. The idea of service, then, I think, brings us to what to a greatly important aspect of the spiritual path. And it is one that in some ways sets Theosophy apart. It sets Theosophy apart from many other approaches to so-called spiritual development and awakening. We ask the question, why? Why do this? Why undertake this very arduous path? Is it so that we can eventually exist in some exalted, blissful condition? Is it so that we can escape from the turmoil and strife of our earthly life? Do we have some kind of a highly inflated, kind of egotistical vision of ourselves as a wise, beneficent being, kind of idealized version of our personality? In a letter to a friend, one of the founders of the Theosophical Society, William Q. Judge, wrote something to the effect that if we Theosophists were to bring about a golden age, if we found ourselves in a world where people everywhere were kind and wise, and where selfishness and cruelty just did not exist, where solidarity and goodwill prevailed, people lived in harmony and peace, what would we do? He said, well, we would have to travel off to some other world where our help was needed. That's an interesting thought. Consider this passage from the Voice of the Silence. If thou art taught that sin is born of action and bliss of absolute inaction, then tell them that they err. Non-permanence of human action, deliverance of the mind from the thraldom by the cessation of sin and faults are not for deva egos. Thus saith the doctrine of the heart. Deva egos refers to the reincarnating ego, and that's us. It is our role to be engaged in the world, however many messes we may make in the process. And so this brings up the Promethean aspect of human evolution that is presented in the Theosophical teachings. Prometheus is one of the Greek gods, a Titan who, seeing the dark, degraded condition of humankind, in an act of supreme compassion, stole fire from Mount Olympus and brought it down to the world. And for this heroic deed, he was punished by being chained to a rock, and his liver was devoured every day by a giant eagle. All this is very symbolic, of course. Fire symbolizes mind or self-consciousness. So we are invited to consider the idea that we are not undertaking this evolutionary journey just for ourselves, and to recognize that in the course of undergoing the long and strenuous task of self-reformation, of taking on this load of matter, so to speak, and undergoing this journey back to the sacred seat, an evolutionary cycle involving countless incarnations. In so doing, we raise up all the lives with which we come into contact, lives that comprise our physical and our astral and our psychic and mental vehicles, and through which we perceive and act. We raise them to a higher level of intelligence and expression. Mr. Judge put this so well in one of his chapters in the Ocean of Theosophy, and Joe, I'll get you to read this.
What then is the universe for? And for what final purpose is man, the immortal thinker, here in evolution? It is all for the experience and emancipation of the soul, for the purpose of raising the entire mass of manifested matter up to the stature, nature, and dignity of conscious godhood. The great aim is to reach self-consciousness, not through a race or a tribe or some favored nation, but by and through the perfecting after transformation of the whole mass of matter, as well as what we now call soul. Nothing is or is to be left out. The aim for present man is his initiation into complete knowledge, and for the other kingdoms below him, that they may be raised up gradually from stage to stage, to be in time initiated also. This is evolution carried to its highest power. It is a magnificent prospect. It makes of man a god, and gives to every part of nature the possibility of being one day the same.
Thank you. Well, Of course, apart from this grand Promethean concept of service and sacrifice on behalf of great nature, there is the idea that we should strive to put ourselves in the background as much as possible, to step out of the sunshine into the shade, to make more room for others, as the voice of the silence puts it, to make ourselves better able to help and teach others. To live to benefit mankind is the first step, the statement in the voice of the silence. In one of his articles, Closed or Open Lodges, Mr. Judge makes I think a really good statement along this line, and this will be our last quote for the day, for my talk. And Joe, could you read this?
It can never be too often repeated that real theosophy is not contemplation or introspection or philosophizing or talk, but work for others, work for the world. We are told that the one fatal bar to progress is selfishness in some one of its protein forms. It will never be overcome by thinking about oneself, but by not thinking about oneself. And as we have to think about something, the alternative is thought for others and how to help them. As the mind fills with such schemes and the hands take hold of them, self-interest is displaced and egoism fades out. Selfishness dies of inanition, and altruism grows because constantly fed. And all this time, true progress goes insensibly on. The mind clears of prejudices and fogs, and the spirit grows more sunny and cheerful. Peacefulness settles over the whole interior being, and truth is seen with greater directness. For the great hindrance to evolution is decaying away.
Thank you. So this idea of service to others then is such an important aspect of the theosophical perspective on the spiritual path. Yes, we can and we must engage in a search for truth, for self-knowledge. But self-knowledge, as the voice teaches us, is of loving deeds the child. We must embody the disciplines indicated by great teachers throughout the ages as the means for reaching to spiritual wisdom. We must learn to quiet the mind and control the mind, and to not be driven by our lower passions and desires, our likes and dislikes. And the attitude we should embrace is that we do this not for our own ultimate bliss and escape from the cares of the world, but to become better, wiser, and more effective servants and co-workers with nature. Thank you. And we'll close this.
Renewing our conception of what the philosopher is and what the philosophical quest is. Very inspiring, very clear. And so now we're going to turn to Wes, and how appropriate, what a perfect dovetail talk. We're going to hear about Plato's Allegory of the Cave.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks, Russ. Thanks, Jerry. Why Plato? And why not Plato? His legacy is an incredible testimony to the human spirit, to the intelligent use of the mind, and ethical inquiry as to what constitutes a good life. His works are just seminal to Western philosophy, and in fact, really part of the entire tradition of thought in the West. But he also fits into a larger world picture. He was contemporary within 100 years or so of Pythagoras, of the Buddha, of Confucius, of Lao Tzu. There's something really incredibly powerful about that period of history. And in fact, Blavatsky's words about him in Introduction to Isis Unveiled pretty much sums it up. That Plato was, in the fullest sense of the word, the world's interpreter. And Russ had talked about Emerson, who wrote that said, out of Plato come all things that are still written and debated among men of thought. That's pretty powerful. We're going to take a look at perhaps why that is through the lens of Plato's Republic, and a very small portion of that in the Allegory of the Cave. The British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead summed up Plato, said that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. We'll try to cover some of those footnotes today, because ever since Plato was translated into Latin from the Greek for the first time in the 15th century by the Italian humanist Marsilio Ficino, Plato has become integral to Western thought. And he is both admired and reviled, but everything from the philosophers of his time through the Dark Ages to our time. Virtually every philosopher since, in one way or another, refers to Plato. Right down to our times, Plato's effect on religion, ethics, politics, literature, science fiction, film. We all owe a debt to Plato. Right down to films like The Matrix, which is a characterization, in a way, of Plato's allegory of the kings. But Plato is both we could interpret him from a psychological, an ethical, a social, and even certainly a political point of view. Some assume that Plato's Republic, for example, should be taken literally, that it's a construct of an ideal society. In fact, it's recognized as the world's first utopia. But Plato readily admits that it probably may never be implemented. Yet he still says, well, something like this must be true. So how does he go about his dialogues? They are all discussions of one form or another. Plato himself said he didn't like books. He also didn't like poetry. He didn't care much for the arts. Fortunately, unlike so many of his contemporaries and many since, his works have come down to us pretty much intact. So we're very, very fortunate to have most of Plato. His methods, despite his dislike of the arts and of books, tell us something about a process of examination. I love the phrase that Russ used, that was really what Socrates was about. Plato's dialogues are a process of examination. They don't explicitly say what the truth or the good or the just or the beautiful might be, but they lead us in that direction. I again liked Thoreau's well, Russ used, that working toward a sympathy with intelligence. That sums up how Plato approaches things. His method is called dialectic or dialogue. And the particular dialogue that we're considering, out of which the allegory of the cave is taken, is called the Republic, Politeia in Greek, or res publica in Latin, literally meaning public affair. But Plato's work in this particular dialogue is an examination of justice. That's the larger construct, we can say. He asks the question, what is justice? And does it pay for an individual to be just? Can a person be selfish and still live well? Why not? Plato examines these views about justice brilliantly in the Republic. And he sets it up so that in order to examine what a just individual might be, he pretends to design a larger society and ask, well, if we can't see the individual very well, maybe if we blow him up and make him look really big, we can see the details by looking at society. In other words, what is a well-run society? What is a well-run government? What should we, how should we structure that? But it's really a question about how do we structure a human being? How do we examine what it is to be human and what a human being ought to do? These are themes taken up not just in the Republic, but throughout Plato's dialogues. He examines what he calls ideal forms, the good, the true, the just, the beautiful. Asks questions like, what is love? What is courage? Those sorts of things are always the topics of his examinations. He never pins them down. He doesn't pin down whatever the highest justice or the highest good might be. But again, to use Thoreau's phrase that Russ used, sympathy with intelligence moves in that direction. And that's I guess, the lesson we take, one of the important lessons we should take then from Plato, is that it tells us something about ourselves, which then we can apply to the world. Let's see, like, get to my next slide. Let's talk then about Plato's allegory. I'm going to assume that most of us have heard of it. We'll also assume that most of us hadn't thought about it in perhaps a little while. Blavatsky starts right off with using Plato and the allegory of the cave at the very beginning of Isis Unveiled. She starts her examination of the search for truth, in a way, through the vehicle of Isis, with a recognition of the importance of Plato. And Plato's approach is that he doesn't take people on straight on. In other words, he doesn't take them on aggressively. He says, rather, in one place in the Republic, speaking of one of the individuals that would probably oppose him, he said, his error is not willful, so let us reason with him gently. And therefore, by engaging with a person gently, we have, through the process of dialectic or dialogue, the ability to see the connections of things. And that's what Plato is trying to do. And his description of the allegory of the cave connects a good portion of the rest of the Republic. And in fact, you could argue that it is central to an understanding of Plato as a whole. Now, this is a visual representation, just one artist's little drawing. And it at first looks a little confusing. We kind of wonder, what in the world is he talking about here? What the first thing to keep in mind is that the cave represents, one could say, two things. It represents the world as we know it, but it also represents the ancient mysteries, which all took place in the dark, under under the light of Dionysus, the influence of the moon, that is of the reflected sun. The sun can't be looked at directly, neither can the supreme good. The agathon of Plato, the good, is always left not fully defined, as is the path out of the cave. You can see here the figures struggling to walk out and then stand outside the cave. Now, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the allegory itself. And here we have some prisoners, and it's a mind construct, you could say, that Socrates is the Plato's voice in the Republic. He supposes that there is this cave in which there are figures chained to facing the back of the cave, and they cannot turn their heads, nor can they move. All they can see are the shadows of things on the wall in front of them. Now, those shadows are being cast by artificial figures of animals and men and birds and trees and other objects, which are held up above a wall, and the light is provided by a fire toward the mouth of the cave, but still behind the prisoners. And all the prisoners can see are these shadows cast by the puppets and the other shape. They cannot turn their heads, so what they see and what they hear is, what they see are the figures on the wall, the reflection, the shadows cast by these artificial figures, and they can hear the voices of those holding the puppets, which, of course, if they can't turn their heads, they assume that it is those objects on the wall that are speaking. And so they become pretty good at guessing what might be the next object to come along, or what else might be said about them. So they have a certain knowledge about the reflections. Now, behind the figures causing the shadows to be cast on the wall is a fire. Well, that fire is at best a reflection, a portion of the sun. It's not the sun itself, but in the circumstances, it's a stand-in. Plato would use the term participates. The fire participates in the heat and light of the sun. It's in itself a kind of a shadow. And then we have the upward passage, the way out of the cave in the allegory. This is a long cave. It's not easy for light to get in from the outside. And outside, of course, one could stand in the sun of truth, and then one could be able to see things as they really are. Now, this is just an outline of the story, which, by the way, only takes 6 or 8 pages, depending, I guess, on the translator, in the entire 350 pages of the Republic. But it's central because it kind of it doesn't set the stage, but it's a keynote. It allows Plato to fully develop his ideas about what it means to get out of the cave, to go from ignorance to knowledge. Most of us would probably recognize the cave, perhaps, as the Hall of Sorrow from the Voice of the Silence. Joe, would you just read that brief quotation here?
From Voice of the Silence. This earth disciple is the hall of sorrow, wherein are set, along the path of dire probations, traps to ensnare thy ego by the delusion called great heresy. This earth, O ignorant disciple, is but the dismal entrance leading to the twilight that precedes the valley of true light. That light which no wind can extinguish, that light which burns without a wick or fuel.
Thank you, Joe. So the cave, in Plato's view, is where we are. What we see are reflections on the of shadows on the wall. The shadows are not only illusory in and of themselves, they're also reflections or shadows of things that are transitory and in fact are not the real at all. So like arts and poetry, Plato, the things we see are reflections of reflections. And those that get out of the cave, he says those who are able to see beyond the shadows and lies of their culture will never be understood, let alone be believed by the masses. Now, that's the dilemma that for those that managed their way out of the cave. Plato also says we can easily forgive a child who's afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light. And this fits with his imagery and how the cave is constructed, because when the individuals leave the cave, then they're as blinded by the light on the outside as they were by the shadows when they were trapped in the cave. It takes a while. It takes a process of adjustment to become accustomed to light, to be able to withstand the sun of truth. And then when an individual goes back into the cave, if one does, as Plato imagines one might do it, one has to adjust their sight once again to the darkness, to the shadows, to the limited vision. And those that are trapped there, those that are still there, probably wouldn't be too happy to be told that the images and the reflections that they've seen and taken for real their entire lives are not real. So that person that leaves and comes back has some real dilemmas to deal with. Their high sight had to adjust to the sunlight, and then again, they had to readjust to the dark. And those that are in the dark don't always take kindly to it being pointed out that it is in fact dark. It's worthwhile spending a couple of minutes then to ask, who are the puppeteers? Who would set up such a thing? And Blavatsky, in her preface to Isis Unveiled, gives us a clue about this, because remember, those of us that have studied a little Theosophy know that Isis Unveiled was Blavatsky's first work, published in 1877, and he knew at that time that it would be challenged and would be not only challenged, but considered threatening. So she asks, we may say in advance that it would not be strange if the following classes should array themselves against us. And she gives a whole list. She mentions the Christians, the scientists, broad churchmen and free thinkers, men of letters, various authorities, and the press. So I would say the puppeteers represent any authority or power structure. Church, society, government, politicians, media, whatever. A ready example, if you get a chance, Review the film The Matrix, came out about, what, 20 years ago or so. We have the machines and Agent Smith enforcing the cave, enforcing the illusions of the computer. Today, if one were to make another type of film, one might compare the cave to a movie theater, where the images on the screen are produced by the light of the projector, and the film itself would be represented by those structures of the puppets and so forth, the animals and plants and birds and other objects that were paraded in front of the flame. The difficulty then for the dwellers in the cave, that is to say, of us, is to move out of the hall of ignorance, the hall of sorrow, into the hall of learning. The voice of the silence says that the name of hall the second is this hall of learning. It's this, in it, thy soul will find the blossoms of life, but under every flower, a serpent coiled. The hall of learning is where we recognize that there is perhaps the fire of light, and that the images that we've took for reality were in fact just that, reflections. Blavatsky calls that Maya, or illusion, but not illusion in the sense just being illusory. Plato's term for that is interesting. We'll get to that in a minute. But he calls it acacia. That is imaging. We get the same word. It comes down to us in our word icon, images, representations. So that's the difficulty of this hall of learning. But for Plato, it is the path upward. It's the passage to the light. It goes by the fire, which represents the sun, but the fire itself is only a temporary and useful and necessary, we'd say, reflection of the sun. It's only when we try to pass out of the cave and come out into the sunlight, into the sun of truth, in Plato's phrase, that we, again, now, as you see the figure here, we have to hold our hands before our eyes. We can't look directly at the truth. Russ pointed this out really well in his presentation. We can see but reflections of the truth. We can see portions of it. And as Plato says, in Lao Tzu, we have his phrase that the Tao that can be expressed is not the eternal Tao. It's again, a reflection upon which we can have a sympathy of intelligence. It's a direction of movement toward the light rather than a full realization of it. Here. So Plato says that the journey upward is the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world. This is the path. This is the difficulty. This represents the striving of someone that knows that has seen that the reflections of just the fire, not everything, that there needs to be more. We have a sense that there has to be more to life. If you look at this image, you can see that the fire is comforting. It's cozy there. It's not too bright. It's not too dark. It's kind of in a middle world there a little bit. So it's difficult to leave the cave entirely. And you can see, when you get outside, it's a rocky path. It's not out of the cave, but we're not fully integrated into the realm of truth yet. Because Plato says there's really he talks about in the Republic, but it's germane to the idea of the cave as well. He says there's three kinds of knowing, three levels of understanding. There's knowledge, there's belief, and there's ignorance. Now, we could imagine that knowledge is of all sorts, but in Plato's thinking, only the greatest realm of the good is true knowledge. Ignorance is its opposite, but not just its opposite in being like a bipolar or a dualistic philosophy. No, ignorance is the lack of knowledge, just simply not participating at that moment in the knowledge of the good. What do we have? We have what he calls belief. Belief can either be correct or incorrect, partially correct. Plato puts it this way. He says that belief is something more obscure than knowledge, but not so dark as ignorance. So it's that in-between place. We can have a correct belief about things, and it can function fairly well for us until our understanding fails. And then we run into the difficulties of life that, like Russ had talked about. And so part of our belief is probably incorrect. And Socrates recognized that. Plato has him saying, if you're not sure that, how am I the wisest man in Athens? Because I don't know anything. Well, that's the realization of the level of belief that it's not correct. And now the next step is toward knowledge. Now, sometimes it's helpful when learning Plato is to kind of look at his two realms. One could say these are the realms that Blavatsky talks about in her article, Psychic and Noetic Action. The larger and truly intelligible world, she says the realm of truth, is the noetic. And the world of appearances, basically we would say this is the psychic. If we want to make psychic and noetic action, the sort of the comparison, which I'm not going to go into, but we'll just take it as a broad outline. The realm of the noetic, Plato says this is the world that we can approach the supreme good, what he calls to agathon, the good. We probably all heard Plato talk about his ideals, the theory of ideals or ideas, theory of forms, the true, the good, the beautiful. These are intangibles, but Plato says this is the real realm of being. And knowing, or episteme, knowledge of that realm, knowledge of that intelligence, that level of intelligence is a knowledge of real being. We get there first by, and we'll go our way back through it through thinking. Thought is really important because we are essentially thinking mind beings. For Plato, one of the most useful ways to get us to think beyond the physical is in the realm of mathematical abstractions. And so, in fact, in his ideal world in the Republic, he has his pupils spend 10 years studying mathematics, geometry, astronomy, astrology, those kinds of things, mathematical objects, he calls them in one place, because they are abstract. They are not just things in the world. The world of appearances, that is what he calls the world of becoming or visible things. These are perceived through the state of mind of belief. He calls belief or opinion doxa, and also pistis or faith. Again, it can be either true or false. We sometimes have true opinions, but very often they are not. We get our words about these kinds of things really through, it's come back down to us in our language. We have words like orthodox, ortho meaning straight or upright or correct, heterodox, hetero, other or different, paradox, that is either next to and side by side or also beyond. And interestingly, have in Sanskrit pari, as in, so meaning beyond, very similar root. So most of what we think we know is simply opinion. And it has to do with the visible world of appearances, the images that are on the wall of the cave cast by the fire, this, say, the secondary light, is a kind of knowledge Plato calls ikasia. Ikasia is imagining things that are temporary, transitory, reflections of objects, images. We take them for being real in and of themselves. No, they're not real. They're temporary. In the same sense that again, Blavatsky uses the term Maya. We find in the Hindu writings, the Sanskrit. So that's kind of where we are as humans, stuck in the world of becoming, trying to get out of that cave of ignorance and reaching toward the real world, the world of being, toward the supreme good. So Plato has us as trying to get out of this cave. But what we have to do is, first of all, he says, have an idea that supreme good even exists. That's the hardest part of getting out of the cave, is the light provided by the sun. Most of us, when we first see that much light, we're kind of like probably Arjuna in the 10th or 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, where he has a vision of the Supreme. He has a vision of Krishna as he really is, and has to ask Krishna to, take it away. I can't see all of that at once. But it's interesting to read what Blavatsky has to say here. Joe, would you share that with your voice, please?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Basing all his doctrines upon the presence of the supreme mind, Plato taught that the nous, spirit, or rational soul of man, being generated by the divine Father, possessed a nature kindred, or even homogeneous, with the divinity, and was capable of beholding the eternal realities. The basis of this assimilation is always asserted to be the pre-existence of the spirit or nous. Life is thus a dream rather than a reality. Like the captives in the subterranean cave described in the Republic, the back is turned to the light. We perceive only the shadows of objects and think them the actual realities. Is not this the same the idea of Maya, or the illusion of the senses in physical life, which is so marked a feature of Buddhistical philosophy?
You're okay?
Yeah. And then it is the province of the discipline of philosophy to disenthrall it from the bondage of sense and raise it into the imperium of pure thought, to the vision of eternal truth, goodness, and beauty.
Thanks, Joe. So this is, in the terms of the voice of the silence, the third hall of wisdom. What Plato is asking us to do through his characterization of the prisoner that escapes from the chains in the Hall of Illusion, from the cave, is to turn around. That's what we essentially have to do in order to enter that path. If we remove a chain or two and turn around and see that the sun, the firelight is there and there are images on the wall, and that's as far as we go, then we'll still be facing the images on the wall. But for the individual that is able to escape that prison, that cave, and eventually work their way out on the path, through the difficulties of life, out into the sunlight. Once they've accustomed their eyes to the brighter light and realize that the trees, the people, the animals, the shapes and forms around me here in the light of sun, light of truth, in the light of the good, one could say, this is the real. Where I was back in the cave with all my friends and family and everyone else chained up, that's a terrible place to be. Here. So that becomes what we could call the dilemma of the Bodhisattva. What to do about everyone else that's in the cave. And we have at the end of the voice of the silence, the teacher asking, now bend thy head and listen well, O Bodhisattva. Compassion speaks and saith, can there be bliss when all that lives must suffer? Shalt thou be saved and hear the whole world cry? This is what great teachers do. They go back. They turn around, they go back into the cave, and they try to get us to listen. Now, what is our reaction? Well, once they get past the gatekeepers, the puppeteers, if you will, and manage to talk to those that are there in the dark, their vision at first is not going to be very good because they've gone from the light into the dark. And now you have a Socrates being accused in one of Plato's dialogues of not being able to defend himself well. Why? Because he's trying to describe to those that only can see shadows what sunlight is. And this is Plato's dilemma. It's his point of education, because he believed and teaches that those of us, all of us, that are chained in the cave facing the shadows have the inherent ability to get out of the cave, to see for ourselves, to turn around ourselves. And it's interesting to see how this plays out in Plato's world of the Republic, because it has to do with how he thinks we should order ourselves, not just as individuals, but also as a society. And he recognizes psychologically how we're put together. And so the classes and social functions in the Republic that he describes are of three broad categories of the philosopher kings, those that govern, those auxiliaries that execute the laws and so forth, and everybody else, those that produce productive things, useful things, the trades, the farmers, and so forth. And these correspond to the qualities in the individual. It's really the aspects of the soul and its affinities, he said. The reason, that is the thinking, knowing portion of it, that portion of us that can know the truth, should be encouraged in everyone in as much as possible. And everyone has that ability to reason. and to govern oneself. But in an ordered society, most will not be able to do that, at least not in this lifetime. And it should be noted, Plato is an advocate of reincarnation. It comes up at the end of the Republic, but also in other dialogues as well. So reason is attracted toward wisdom. What he calls spirit doesn't mean what we mean when we think of an Atman, doesn't mean it at all. He's really talking about the energy of integrity and honor, which was greatly prized in Greek culture. And it's an interesting and somewhat difficult quality to describe, but in a sense, we could say it's karma as a reflection of reason and wisdom. And then there is all the things that we need, both physically and socially, our individual appetites and needs of the body, the need to have gain in society, say being a farmer or a tradesperson. There is always in Plato the better aspect implied of anything that he talks about. Because remember, the greatest good is universal. And there is no devil to oppose. There is no evil nature per se. There's only a lack of wisdom. And that's really what Plato is encouraging us to do in terms of society as well as in terms of ourselves. I don't think Plato, this is just in one student's view, I don't think he ever expected his republic to be implemented the way he lays it out in the Republic, that society. What he does, he uses it to indicate what it means to educate and to move from a simple understanding of the world in the cave past the fires of life and the reflections that they cast toward the realm of the philosopher, toward the realm of the ruler. And he says the philosopher king is really the individual that needs to rule, and we need to rule ourselves with wisdom, not because we want to, but because we have to. In one place, he said, toward the end of the Republic, he says that the wise are reluctant to govern the affairs of men. But to have the best society, that is to have the best individuals, so ourselves, the rulers and the philosopher kings, those that have reached to at least some vision of the good, to wisdom, for us to have the best society and individuals, those individuals have to return and try to improve the commonwealth as a whole. And so that takes us back to the idea of this republic, of a republic of conscience, a republic of self-rule by the best in each of us. And by that means, we are able to escape the darkness of the cave of ignorance and help others along the path to see the light. That's pretty much, I think. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.